Hello, I'm Forbes Walker. I am the University of Tennessee environmental soil specialist. And today we're going to talk about soil health research that we've been doing at the University of Tennessee. And we're going to go back about 40 years and talk about some of the results that we have found. Soil health, as you know, has received a lot of attention in the last few years, especially given the emphasis that the United States Department of Agriculture has put on it. They have a number of different definitions out there. This is some strategies to promote soil health developed from a paper that John Doran from the USDA put out in 2000, talking about strategies that minimize soil erosion, that conserve and build soil organic matter, and balance production and make better use of our natural resources, are all practices that will go to promote soil health. Some of the practices specifically are the use of conservation tillage and reduced tillage systems, the use of cover crops, as well as good nutrient management. Soil health is a suite of different practices, including things like crop rotations, cover crops, no-till and mulching, and practices that require less soil disturbance, provide a living root system throughout the year, and improve crop diversity and keep the soils covered. Rarely are these practices put in just in a single practice approach. We're combining many different practices in the field at the same time. So before we start talking about soil health, let's look at what some of our previous practices had done to our soils and to the environment. Here's some pictures I got out of the Tennessee State Library archives, looking at an eroded soil from Milan back in 1938. You can see heavy erosion rates. Use of tillage was ubiquitous across the state when planting crops, and the resulting thing was often a lot of soil leaving the fields, a lot of silted streams and rivers. In the 30s and 40s, especially after the Dust Bowl era, there was different attempts at reducing erosion. A lot of these things weren't very widely adopted because they required people switch between intensive cropping systems and less intensive cropping systems. One strategy was to rotate between pasture systems and row crop systems, or have strips in a field. And other practices were things like using contour plowing. Here's a photograph from the same archives using mules, plowing along the contour rather than up and down the field. The use of terraces. Some of these practices were adopted, but often they required a lot of expense, especially when you're talking about using terraces. You have to get some heavy equipment. And so the adoption of some of these things wasn't very widespread. But the big thing is, how could we keep on intensively cropping and control erosion? Let's skip forward to the type of system that we have currently in Tennessee. This is typical of a no-till system, starting in the top left, using a winter wheat cover to protect the soil by growing a crop over the winter months, so reducing erosion rates over the winter. We come in the springtime and we terminate that cover crop, typically with a herbicide. Then rather than totally invert the soil, we're going to plant directly into a very narrow slit in the soil. We've got good soil to seed contact, and this is the emerging corn, still with the last season's crop residues on the surface. So this is the kind of system we have in Tennessee. The system has been very widely adopted in Tennessee. This is a graphic showing the report from the Soil Health Institute, where Tennessee is the #1 state in terms of adoption. They rate us at over 75%. Our cover crop adoption is only 10 to 15%, so still some room for improvement there. How did we come to, how did no-till adoption happen in Tennessee? Up until the 90s, it was very much a focus on high residue corn systems. Those were relatively easy to get no-till to work. In the mid 90s, we had the introduction of Roundup Ready traits in our major crops in corn, in cotton and soybeans led to really quick adoption rates. And today, and this is data from 2018 survey, soybeans are about 85% of what the soybeans in the state are no-till, 80% of cotton, and 75.6% of corn. So we have led the nation in terms of development as well as in terms of the adoption. In the early days in the 60s and 70s, some of the challenges, the technical challenges were in how do we control weeds if we're not going to till, and how do we get equipment that can put the seed in the ground without disturbing too much soil. This was not, one entity only working on this. It was a combination of professionals from the University of Tennessee Extension, as well as the United States Department of Agriculture. Back in the early 80s, 1983, one of our experiment stations in West Tennessee at Milan in Gibson County went completely no-till starting in 1983. There was a lot of attention from the field days that was had at that research station. Peaking in 1995, the attendance was over 11,000 individuals. The last time we had it in person was 2018. We still had over 2,000 individuals. And last year, because of the pandemic, we had the field day virtually, and all the talks are available online. This is one of the very famous early photographs looking at the impact of till versus conventional tillage. This is cotton growing on a slope. On the left-hand side, we've got cotton in a no-till system, and cotton in a conventionally tilled system. And you can see the color of the water from the runoff from the tilled side compared with the no-tills, compared with the conventionally tilled side. So this is the type of visual things that really got people thinking, gosh, it is possible to till or to grow a crop without tilling. So the erosion, reductions in erosion are fairly phenomenal with no-till systems. This is a tool, the Revised Universal Soil Loss Equation, which is a tool used by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And basically what with this particular equation, we're looking at rainfall R, rainfall intensity, as well as frequency. L and S, this is how steep and how long slopes are. K is the erosivity of the soil. C is how much cover do we have on the soil surface protecting it. And P is what other practices do we have. What we've done here is we've run some examples from Gibson County, which is where Milan is, a typical Grenada soil on a 2 to 6% slope. If we're growing corn in a conventionally plowed system, we can expect every year to lose 64 tons of soil per acre per year. Converting to no-till, we dramatically reduce that to less than 2 tons, less than 1.5 tons per acre per year. And can we do better? Yes, we can add a cover crop behind that and reduce the erosion to less than 1 ton. That is corn, which is a heavy residue system. Those were where some of the early adoption was. More challenging was the development of no-till systems for low residue systems such as soy and cotton. So soybeans, plowed situation, 95 tons soil loss, down to 14 tons with no-till, less than 4 tons with no-till or a cover crop. Cotton, more extreme case, 100 tons to 19 tons to less than 5 tons. So cotton really is, if we can get a good no-till system in cotton with cover crops, then we are then we're seeing some dramatic effects. What I want to talk to you about now is the use of cover crops. So what are cover crops? These are crops that we typically plant after the harvest of the main cash crop. For us, the main cash crop being corn, soybeans, or cotton. And the idea here is we plant these crops, and then over the winter we have something growing in the field, and it's further reducing soil erosion losses. Now, in this discussion about soil health, I want to talk about 3 long-term experiments that we've been using to study the effects of the impacts of different practices on the health of the soil. Starting with a long-term experiment started in Jackson in 1981. Talk a little bit about a rotational study that we started in 2002, and a shorter-term cover crop study that we started in 2013. So the long-term cover crop experiment was started by Dr. Don Tyler, former colleague, since retired, back in 1981. And the treatments in this particular experiment, a very elegant experiment with till versus no-till, looking at different single species cover crops, wheat, hairy vetch, and crimson clover, and different nitrogen rates, 0, 13, 60, and 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre, or these are the numbers that we use on the papers that we write. They're quoted in kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So student that just graduated last summer looked at, went to all these plots, 128 plots, sampled them, and looked at changes in the carbon numbers with different, under different tillage and cover crops. What he found was that crimson clover and hairy vetch significantly increased the total organic carbon compared with the cover and the wheat. So after almost 40 years of this particular system. Similar numbers were found for dissolved organic carbon. Dissolved organic carbon is believed to be more biologically available. And so if we're looking at soil health, if we can have carbon in a form that's more biologically available, we should be able to stimulate more biological activity. We also find overall, for all the no-till treatments and all the conventionally tilled treatments, we found a significant increase in the total organic carbon compared in the no-till system compared with the conventionally tilled system. We also looked at the wet aggregate stability. So how do these aggregates hold up to impact and to erosion, the erosive forces? This is really important if you, especially in the modern times, we're having much more intensive rainfall events. So we not only want our soils to be able to avoid erosion, but also can the aggregates hold up against the erosive impact of rainfall. And what we found was in the crimson clover plots, the significantly higher amount of wet aggregates, of stable wet aggregates compared to the no cover and the wheat cover. And there was a significant increase in these aggregates, these stable aggregates in the no-till system compared with the conventional till system. Moving on to nitrogen, we found that vetch had a significant increase in the total nitrogen compared to the wheat and the no cover. This is really because of the biomass that we produce from vetch. Vetch is obviously a leguminous cover crop. It fixes its own nitrogen, but it produces much more biomass than crimson clover. And this is why we see this increased amount of nitrogen compared with the crimson clover. Note that there was a significant increase in the nitrogen in the fertilized rates compared with the unfertilized, but there was no difference between the different rates, this being the 30, 60 and 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And tillage had no effect on the total nitrogen. So there was no difference between the tilled plots and the no-till plots. In 2018, when the study was conducted, there was a significant increase in the yield under the vetch cover crop compared with the no cover, compared to the crimson clover or the wheat. And the nitrogen fertilizer significantly increased the yield compared to the no fertilizer, but there was no significant difference between the nitrogen rates, and that no-till overall significantly increased the yield. So how is this, and how and why is this yield increasing? So this is another study that another student did for his PhD. He was on the same plots, and he was looking at infiltration rates, comparing the no-till system with the conventionally tilled system. And you can see the infiltration under the no-till system, this is continuous cotton again, was significantly higher than the conventionally tilled. If you move from the no cover to the vetch, we saw an increase of almost 1 inch of infiltration per hour. With the no-till, with the difference between the no cover and the vetch, was almost 3 inches, so dramatic increases in infiltration. Obviously, we want to see more infiltration because more infiltration means less runoff means less erosion. And also, if we do capture more of that rainfall in the soil profile, we can help the growing crops when we start to run into some drier periods of the growing season. And this is what we all see. Amin also looked at the water availability in the dry periods. Overall, there was more water in the no-till systems compared with the conventionally tilled systems, and there was more water available in the vetch compared to the wheat, compared to the cover crop, or the no cover crop treatments. I will say we've been doing some other work looking at infiltration in long-term no-till systems. So that previous study was comparing no-till with tilled systems. We've been looking at a study, we've been looking at infiltration rates using measuring saturated hydraulic conductivity using a new piece of equipment, and at Milan and in Spring Hill. And you'll notice with these different cover crops, the cereal rye and crimson clover, the wheat, the cereal rye by itself, a soil health mix, and a no cover control, no real difference in the Milan site or the Spring Hill site. This is a bit of a surprise to us. And what we have hypothesized is happening here is that both of these are long-term no-till systems in this corn soy rotation, and the variability and that we see is due to the preferential flow pathways from the earthworms. So these soils are very well, already got good structure, and they have a lot of earthworms and other macroarthropods that are creating these burrows that are enabling us to infiltrate a lot of water. Moving on to soil microbial biomass carbon. This is a study that we did in 2013, again on the same plots. We focused only on the wheat, vetch, and no cover. We didn't look at the crimson clover, and looked at the no-till and the till, and the three different, the two different rates of fertilizer, and the one compared with the control. And we sampled at different times during the growing season. Again, this was cotton that we were sampling. So what we found was there was no difference in the microbial biomass between the wheat, vetch, or the covers on any of the times that we sampled. There was, however, higher biomass with the no-till only in the September sampling. So we saw no difference in the June or July or the October, but we did see in the September. And you can see no-till had higher biomass in the September timeframe for the 0 nitrogen plots, the 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre plots, and the 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre plots. We also find differences in the biomass with the different nitrogen rates. We found higher biomass with the higher nitrogen rates in the earlier time of the year, the June and July. That's where we're fertilizing the soils, and the microbes are responding. By September and October, there was no difference observed in the soil microbial biomass. So things are happening with the soil microbes, but what exactly is happening? So we had another student, Lillian Bouthia, who looked at different aspects of community structure, again, in these same plots. She looked at different fatty acid biomarkers, different bacteria strains, fungal things, and actinomycetes. And what she was able to do was gradually tease out some difference in the microbial populations under the vetch plots compared with the wheat plots. Wasn't much difference between the wheat and the no cover plots, but the wheat and the vetch, there were some differences. She found differences in enzyme activity. We found higher enzyme activity, this enzyme particularly important in chitin hydrolysis. We found it higher in the vetch, in the no-till vetch plots compared with the others. So there's obviously something going on, this interaction between the tillage as well as the cover crop. She also found less mycorrhizae under the hairy vetch compared to the wheat and no cover. So we didn't follow through with this, but we suspect there may be some better water relations, and so mycorrhizae weren't forming under these systems on the hairy vetch system. Another student looked at what type of sugars were present, and so one type of things is the carbon source. What type of carbon do we have? How available is this? And so amino sugars are being used to look to, and they're believed to contribute to the stable carbon and nitrogen pools. And so they're used as a way of we believe that they're good for soil health. They're typically present in low concentrations, What we found here was, where are they accumulating? And look at what we're looking at was the different aggregates. So this is the aggregates above 2 millimeters, the aggregates less than 0.25 millimeters. And you can see a significant difference in the no-till vetch and the amino sugars here compared with the conventionally tilled vetch. So these are some more interesting things. So basically what's going on here is the aggregates are, these sugars are going into the larger aggregates in the vetch system, whereas in the wheat system, they're going into the smaller aggregates. This slide here looks at, this is unpublished data from other studies that have been conducted to basically look at how are bacterial communities changing with fertilizer and tillage systems. So here with the black dots are the zero nitrogen rate, and the orange dots here are the fertilizer at the rate of 60 pounds of nitrogen. And you can see nice separation of the different treatments. The triangles here are the conventional tilled treatments, and the circles are the no-till treatments. So we're seeing differences in the communities, the microbial communities under these different treatments. This is another study. This is a study. This is the rotational study at Milan. We've only got a couple of slides we're talking about here. Again, these are kind of busy slides, but basically what we're looking at are the different cropping rotations: continuous cotton, continuous corn, corn-soy rotation, continuous soybeans. And you can see how the communities are scattered according to whether we're on a fallow or the control, no things, so we're using poultry litter or the wheat or the vetch. So the community structure is changing under these different management practices. Also observed, looking at different bacterial groups. This one group here is a group that's suspected is important in the denitrification and resilience. And they find that this, with under the vetch treatments, which is the dark bars here, you can see an increase in the activity of these particular microbes. Viruses is another emerging area that we're looking at. In the past, we haven't really looked much at viruses in soils. Viruses are supposed to be, are believed to be influenced very heavily by water and temperature. We find a lot of viruses in wetland soils. They are thought to be very important in organic matter decomposition, as well as carbon and nutrient cycling, greenhouse gas emissions, basically controlling the activities of the bacteria. This graph here, again, more unpublished data. You can see the virus numbers, this light green colors, much fewer viruses in these conventionally tilled systems under the no residue, the vetch and the wheat, compared with the no-till system. So something is going on there. We're still learning what roles viruses play in the world of soil biology. Shifting gear now, looking more about this shorter term experiment. This is an experiment which we started in Milan in 2013. We actually had a couple of experiments, one looking at what's the best way to plant cover crops. Do we broadcast or can we drill? And we were growing these in a corn-soy rotation. We'll talk about this in the next few slides. Another one was a timing study. When is the best time to plant your cover crops? Before harvest, immediately after harvest, or wait 2 or 3 weeks? I'm not going to report on this particular study, but basically it very much depends on the season and the soil moisture. If you're planting your cover crops when the soil is dry, it's very difficult. If you're planting your cover crops when the soil is wet, it's also very difficult. So paying attention to soil moisture is very important. In these particular studies, we're looking at single species, dual species, so typically a grass with a legume, and multi-species. And some of the things we were looking at were the biomass production, as well as the weed suppression and the yields. This is a study that a PhD student in Jackson Garrett Montgomery did, and he looked at growing single species cover crops, and as well as combinations or wheat vetch combination. And he found out that by growing a good cover crop, that you can cut out a pre-emergence herbicide and thereby help pay for the cover crop things. Another student, recently Mani Sabah, this is looked at weed suppression. This is a paper he recently put out last year. You can look at the ground cover, or i.e. the weeds under the control versus the wheat, the cereal rye, the two species mixes in this. And you can see cover crops, if it was a single, no matter what type of cover crop, the weed suppression was always better compared with the no cover crops. Mani also looked at the rate of decomposition and found out that usually within 30 days, about half of the above ground biomass is decomposed. So that's something we need to pay attention to. Other issues that I won't talk to you very much about is the growing of cereal rye when you want to plant corn afterwards. We've got to be very careful with having too much biomass. Sometimes we can suppress our yields. We have different strategies. For example, putting nitrogen down to break down the cereal rye seems to be an effective thing. Our entomologists are also saying that with the potential for carryover from a green cover crop to the growing crop, it's very important to use an insecticide seed treatment. And they've got data to suggest that, yes, insecticide seed treatments are very important in suppressing early emergence insects. The impact of cover crops on yields. This is this particular study. Remember, we established it in 2013. We are rotating between soybeans and corn, That first year we had slug issues, so emergence was an issue, but we had no significant difference in yield. Second year we had corn. Looks like there were some differences, but these were not significant. In that third year, it was 2016, considered to be a dry year. We did see a significant yield response with the 5 species soil health mix, which was a combination of cereal rye, common oats, crimson clover, hairy vetch, and daikon radish. There was really no consistent difference between the drilled and the broadcasting. So we did see that, yes, we did see a yield response in this particular dry year. We've talked already about infiltration. This is an example of a demonstration that we did at Milan back in 2018, looking at the soils from a vertically tilled soil, a control with no cover crop, cereal rye, and crimson clover, and the soil health mix. And you can see these bottles underneath showing how much infiltration is going on. So great infiltration under the cover crop treatments, very little infiltration under the non-cover crop treatments. And conversely, we have a lot of runoff. Look at the color of the runoff coming from the vertical tillage and the control systems. Back in 2016, when we did have that yield response, another student, Mingwei Chu, looked at, well, why did we see this yield difference? So he looked at the chemistry. He found no difference in the carbon numbers between these different cover crop treatments, no difference in the water extractable nitrogen, and no difference in the total organic carbon. He did, however, find differences in the soil moisture. You can see significantly higher soil moisture under the soil health mix treatment, which is where we saw the yield, but really no difference within the other things. Suggestion was, do we see better infiltration? I think we're learning that in this long-term no-till system, this corn soybean rotation, we're not seeing differences in infiltration. We may be in the cotton systems, but not in these systems. We didn't, the other suggestion was, did we change the biology? We didn't look at that, but that's another possibility. Putting this all together, this is a very, very busy slide, but it basically summarizes cotton yields in that cotton experiment in Jackson, going back to the mid-80s up to the present. And you can see the yield varies year by year, obviously depending on rainfall. This is rain-fed, there's no irrigation here. What I'd like to show you here is the influence of the cover crops especially. So the cover crops are these red, yellow, and green things, and you can see they're always at the top of the yield no matter what year it is. And so this is a great example of, how the cover crops are improving the stability of the yield going over the years. Another great benefit of so let's just summarize the benefits of no-till. So we know we've demonstrated dramatic reductions in erosion. Remember that revised universal soil loss equation, going down from maybe even 100 tons of soil loss per acre to less than 4 or 5 in these cotton systems. One of the many reasons for adoption is the return on expenses are much more favorable in the no-till system compared with the till system. This is an example of the crop budgets that our Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics put out every year. This is for 2021. And the return on expenses for a no-till system is 118. Here we're budgeting for 170 bushel corn compared with a return on expenses of $100 for the till system. And the difference is the machinery and the labor costs in the main part. Under no-till, we see increases in soil carbon, we see improvements in aggregate stability, and we see changes in soil biology and microbial biomass. With the cover crop benefits that we've observed, we see increases in carbon, both total and dissolved carbon, increases in the wet aggregate stability. We see more nitrogen with leguminous cover crops, especially the high biomass cover crops like vetch. We've observed better infiltration and soil moisture in tilled systems compared with no-till systems. And in the no-till cotton, long-term no-till cotton experiment, we've seen weed suppression with cover crop systems, and we have observed changes in soil biology associated with nutrient and carbon cycling. And we also have seen that the use of cover crops in combination with no-till increase yield stability, especially under weather extremes, more floods, more droughts, more heat periods. So all in all, looking at our soil health practices, tillage, cover crops, and nutrient management, we have observed over the last 40 years some significant benefits of these systems, especially if they're put together. These systems were originally started in the 80s to reduce erosion and water quality. We've since learned that what reduces erosion improves soil quality, improves soil health, and also helps to build soil resilience against weather extremes. More floods, if you get more floods, you've got better infiltration. We're going to have less runoff, less erosion. Because we're capturing that moisture in the soil profile, we're better able to manage droughts or dry periods. And because we got a residue on the surface and we're not exposing the soil directly to the suns, we also got some good heat management. We also believe that in the future, economics and carbon credit markets will also be make these systems very, very attractive to producers. And just before I sign off, I want to share with you a photograph that a colleague of mine recently shared with me. She was going through an old box of pictures, old photographs in the basement in our department. She came across this photograph, which on the back of it has written Cover Crops Tour, April the 21st, 1938. And it says oats seeded by use of the TVA drill. So they had a cover crop tour back in 1938. We're still talking about cover crops in 2021, almost 80 plus years later. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.